What drives a soldier to crawl inside a rotting log in enemy territory and remain motionless for days, knowing discovery means certain death? The answer reveals something profound about the nature of warfare, survival, and the thin line between reckless bravery and tactical genius. Throughout military history, unconventional methods have separated legendary warriors from forgotten names, and nowhere is this more evident than in the story of improvised sniper concealment that defied every conventional wisdom of the era. The hollow log sniper hide represents one of warfare's most controversial yet effective tactical innovations. When soldiers first witnessed a comrade disappearing into a decaying tree trunk to establish a firing position, reactions ranged from mockery to outright condemnation. Officers called it suicidal. Fellow soldiers labeled it a death trap with no escape route. Military doctrine had no provision for such extreme concealment methods, and many believed the tactic violated fundamental principles of maintaining tactical mobility and fallback positions. Yet in the crucible of combat, this unconventional approach would prove devastatingly effective, saving countless lives and forcing military establishments to reconsider long-held assumptions about sniper tactics. This is the story of how desperation, ingenuity, and intimate knowledge of terrain combined to create a concealment method that transformed sniper warfare. It's a tale that challenges our understanding of acceptable risk in combat and demonstrates how individual innovation can reshape military doctrine when traditional methods fail. The hollow log hide would become a symbol of the resourcefulness required to survive against overwhelming odds, and its legacy continues influencing special operations and sniper tactics to this day. Snipers have existed as long as accurate firearms, but their role crystallized during the American Civil War, when rifled muskets extended effective ranges beyond what smoothbore weapons could achieve. Soldiers discovered that skilled marksmen positioned in concealed locations could inflict casualties, far exceeding their numbers, disrupting enemy operations through psychological impact as much as physical damage. Confederate sharpshooters at battles like Gettysburg demonstrated how individual riflemen could influence tactical situations, forcing Union officers to take cover and complicating command and control. World War I transformed sniping from opportunistic shooting into a systematic military discipline. The static nature of trench warfare created perfect conditions for sniper operations, with opposing forces occupying fixed positions separated by no man's land. German snipers initially dominated this new battlefield, using hunting rifles equipped with telescopic sights and employing patient stalking techniques learned in European forests. British and French forces suffered devastating casualties from German snipers before developing their own sniper programs that emphasized both marksmanship and fieldcraft. Concealment became the defining characteristic, separating effective snipers from casualties. Early war snipers often fired from obvious positions, like building windows or trench parapets, achieving initial success before counter-snipers or artillery eliminated them. Survival required developing camouflage techniques that allowed snipers to blend completely into their environment. British snipers pioneered the use of camouflaged screens made from burlap covered with natural vegetation, creating artificial features that appeared natural to enemy observers. German snipers constructed elaborate hides that incorporated steel shields with small firing ports, providing protection while maintaining concealment. The concept of remaining motionless for extended periods emerged as critical to sniper survival. Movement attracted attention, and even slight shifts could reveal positions to vigilant enemy observers. Successful snipers learned to control their breathing, minimize motion while observing through scopes, and resist the urge to adjust uncomfortable positions. This required extraordinary discipline and physical endurance, particularly when operating in extreme weather conditions that made immobility intensely uncomfortable. World War II saw continued evolution of sniper tactics across multiple theaters. Soviet snipers became legendary for their effectiveness during urban combat at Stalingrad, where ruins provided countless concealment opportunities. Snipers like Vasily Zaitsev achieved fame by using rubble piles, destroyed buildings, and shell craters as hides, engaging German forces at ranges where return fire proved difficult. The urban environment favored patient stalkers who could position themselves among debris that enemy forces had learned to ignore as part of the landscape. Pacific theater combat presented different challenges. Dense jungle vegetation offered concealment opportunities, but also limited fields of fire and complicated range estimation. Japanese snipers developed techniques for climbing trees and concealing themselves in foliage, creating elevated positions that provided excellent observation and fields of fire. American forces initially suffered significant casualties from these tree-borne snipers before developing counter-tactics that involved systematically searching vegetation and employing their own snipers to neutralize Japanese positions. The effectiveness of Japanese snipers in the Pacific stemmed partly from cultural factors that Western military forces initially underestimated. Japanese military tradition emphasized patience, acceptance of hardship, and willingness to sacrifice individual survival for mission success. Japanese snipers would remain in concealed positions for days without moving, accepting dehydration, hunger, and extreme discomfort as necessary components of their duty. They tied themselves to tree branches to prevent falling if they lost consciousness, and they sometimes continued fighting, even after sustaining wounds that would incapacitate most soldiers. American forces learned painful lessons about the inadequacy of conventional counter-sniper tactics against such dedicated adversaries. Standard procedures involved identifying sniper positions through muzzle flash or sound, then suppressing them with return fire. Japanese snipers negated these methods by firing single shots and immediately becoming motionless, making position identification nearly impossible. They chose positions that provided natural sound dampening and muzzle flash concealment, further complicating American efforts to locate and eliminate them. The Korean and Vietnam Wars further refined sniper concealment techniques in varied terrain. Korean mountains required different approaches than Vietnamese jungles, but both environments demanded that snipers become virtually invisible to survive. Marine snipers in Vietnam pioneered the use of ghillie suits, elaborate camouflage garments covered with strips of burlap and natural vegetation that broke up human outlines and allowed wearers to blend into brush and grass. These suits, combined with patient movement and careful position selection, enabled snipers to establish firing positions within meters of enemy trails without detection. By the time hollow log hides emerged as a documented tactic, military doctrine had established clear principles for sniper concealment. Positions should provide multiple escape routes, allow observation in multiple directions, and enable the sniper to withdraw rapidly if compromised. Snipers were taught never to position themselves in locations where they could be trapped, as being pinned down meant death or capture. The ideal hide offered concealment, a clear field of fire toward expected enemy positions, and the ability to displace before enemy forces could organize effective response. Natural features like rock outcroppings, dense brush, and terrain irregularities provided preferred concealment locations. Military training emphasized using what the environment offered rather than creating obvious artificial positions that might attract attention. Snipers learned to position themselves where enemy soldiers would naturally avoid looking, taking advantage of human tendencies to focus on obvious threats while overlooking subtle anomalies in their environment. The psychology of concealment deserves examination. Effective camouflage works by exploiting how human vision processes information. People see what they expect to see, and brains filter out details that don't match anticipated patterns. A motionless sniper positioned among vegetation or rubble blends into the visual noise of a complex environment, becoming effectively invisible despite being in plain sight. This phenomenon, called selective attention, means that even soldiers actively searching for threats can look directly at concealed positions without recognizing them as dangerous. However, this concealment only works when snipers remain absolutely still. The human eye detects motion far more effectively than subtle shapes, an evolutionary adaptation that helped our ancestors identify both prey and predators. Even slight movement creates visual signals that draw attention, breaking the camouflage illusion and revealing the sniper's position. This biological reality explains why sniper training emphasizes motionlessness as much as marksmanship. The best shooting skills prove useless if movement reveals the shooter before they can fire. The physiological challenges of extended immobility proved more severe than many anticipated. Human bodies aren't designed for absolute stillness over prolonged periods. Muscles require periodic movement to maintain circulation and prevent cramping. Joints stiffen without regular articulation. The cardiovascular system struggles to maintain adequate blood flow to extremities during extended static positions. Snipers had to develop techniques for subtle muscle tensing and relaxation that maintained physiological function without creating visible movement, a skill that required extensive practice and body awareness. Environmental factors complicated concealment further. Temperature extremes affected both snipers and their equipment. Cold weather caused muscle stiffness and made maintaining stillness more difficult as bodies instinctively shivered to generate heat. Hot weather brought dehydration concerns and the temptation to seek shade or adjust positions for comfort. Rain created noise that could mask movement, but also made maintaining dry firing positions challenging. Wind moved vegetation, creating visual noise that could mask sniper positions, but also making it harder to detect enemy movement through observation. The exact origins of using hollow logs as sniper hides remain obscured by the fog of war and the tendency of successful tactics to be adopted widely without clear attribution. However, documented instances and veteran accounts allow reconstruction of how this technique developed and spread through military forces facing desperate tactical situations. The technique likely emerged independently in multiple theaters, where dense forests provided both cover and killing zones. Soldiers operating in heavily wooded terrain quickly recognized that fallen trees, particularly large specimens that had rotted sufficiently to create hollow interiors, offered unique concealment opportunities. Unlike artificial hides that required construction and might appear suspicious to enemy patrols, hollow logs existed naturally in forested environments, attracting no particular attention from forces moving through areas. Early adopters of hollow log concealment probably used these positions opportunistically rather than systematically. A sniper fleeing enemy forces might crawl into a hollow log to escape detection, discovering that the position offered excellent concealment and adequate fields of fire through gaps in the rotting wood. Success in surviving enemy searches or achieving surprise kills from these improvised positions would encourage repeated use and experimentation with techniques for maximizing their effectiveness. The Pacific Theater during World War II created conditions particularly suited to hollow log tactics. Dense jungle growth meant that large trees fell regularly, creating abundant hollow logs in various stages of decay. Japanese forces controlled much of the terrain initially, forcing American and Allied troops to operate in environments where enemy could be anywhere. Japanese defensive tactics emphasized camouflage and surprise, with soldiers concealing themselves in spider holes, bunkers, and natural features to ambush advancing Americans. Allied forces needed comparable concealment to counter these tactics effectively. Marine snipers operating on islands like Guadalcanal, Peleliu, and Okinawa faced enemy forces that had months or years to prepare defensive positions. Japanese soldiers had intimate knowledge of terrain and could move through jungle with stealth that Americans initially couldn't match. Marine snipers who survived early engagements learned that standard concealment techniques developed for European warfare proved inadequate in Pacific jungle environments. The density of vegetation meant that snipers needed to position themselves within meters of trails and defensive positions to achieve effective fields of fire, requiring concealment methods that could withstand close-range scrutiny. One documented early use of hollow log concealment involved a Marine sniper on Peleliu in 1944. The sniper, whose name appears in unit records but whose specific identity remains unclear in available sources, established a position inside a large fallen tree overlooking a Japanese supply trail. The log had deteriorated sufficiently that the sniper could crawl inside through the root ball end, then position himself facing down the hollow interior toward the opposite end, which provided a natural firing port partially obscured by remaining bark and debris. The position proved extraordinarily effective. Over 3 days, the sniper eliminated multiple Japanese soldiers moving along the trail, achieving kills at ranges under 100 meters where misses were nearly impossible. Japanese forces recognized they were taking casualties from sniper fire but couldn't locate the source, despite searching the area multiple times. Patrols walked within feet of the hollow log without recognizing it as a hide. Their attention focused on vegetation and elevated positions where they expected snipers to conceal themselves. When the Marine finally withdrew from the position, he reported his success to his spotter and platoon commander. Initial reactions mixed skepticism with concern. The position violated fundamental principles taught in sniper training. It offered only one escape route, provided no lateral observation, and placed the sniper in a confined space where discovery would mean certain death. However, the results couldn't be dismissed. The sniper had achieved significant enemy casualties while remaining completely undetected, demonstrating effectiveness that conventional positions hadn't matched. Word of this success spread through sniper communities via the informal networks that connect specialists across military units. Snipers shared techniques and observations that official channels often overlooked, creating a body of practical knowledge that sometimes conflicted with formal doctrine. The hollow log technique entered this underground curriculum, with snipers discussing its advantages and dangers in conversations that officers rarely overheard. The informal knowledge transfer among snipers operated through multiple channels. Veterans returning from combat zones shared experiences with replacement snipers during brief periods in rear areas. Letters between snipers serving in different units described successful techniques and cautioned against methods that had proven dangerous. Most importantly, experienced snipers mentored newer personnel during actual operations, passing along practical wisdom that formal training hadn't covered. This oral tradition preserved innovations that bureaucratic military institutions would have lost or deliberately suppressed. The Vietnam War saw renewed interest in hollow log concealment as American forces faced enemy who used the jungle with masterful effectiveness. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army forces moved through dense vegetation using trails that Americans struggled to locate, much less interdict. American snipers needed positions that allowed them to observe these trails while remaining undetectable to enemy forces that knew the terrain intimately and moved with caution born of experience. Marine and Army snipers operating in the Central Highlands and other heavily forested areas experimented with various natural concealment methods. Hollow logs offered advantages that other positions couldn't match. The interior of a rotting log provided overhead concealment that protected against aerial observation and shielded the sniper from rain. The confined space retained body heat during cool nights while providing shade during scorching days. Most critically, hollow logs blended perfectly into jungle environments, attracting no attention from enemy forces that had learned to identify artificial hides and suspicious terrain features. However, using hollow logs effectively required solving several technical problems. The interior of rotting logs often contained insects, including ants, spiders, and centipedes that could inflict painful bites or stings. Snipers learned to inspect logs carefully before occupying them, clearing obvious insect nests, while accepting that some creatures would inevitably share their hide. The confined space made movement difficult and created claustrophobic conditions that some soldiers found intolerable. Snipers who used hollow logs needed psychological resilience to remain calm in tight spaces for extended periods. The insect problem proved more serious than initial users anticipated. Tropical environments hosted arthropods, whose bites could cause severe reactions ranging from painful swelling to dangerous allergic responses. Centipedes in Southeast Asian jungles grew to lengths exceeding 30 centimeters and possessed venomous bites that caused excruciating pain and tissue damage. Scorpions, though less common in extremely humid environments, occasionally inhabited hollow logs in drier areas. Even non-venomous insects like ants could make concealment unbearable if they swarmed over a motionless sniper who couldn't move to brush them away. Snipers developed various methods for managing the insect threat. Some carried insect repellent, though the strong chemical odor could alert enemy forces with keen senses of smell. Others used tobacco, either smoking it to create repellent smoke before entering hides or placing loose tobacco around entry points to deter crawling insects. The most effective approach involved careful inspection and selective clearing of obvious threats, while accepting that complete insect elimination was impossible. Successful hollow log snipers developed psychological techniques for tolerating insect presence without allowing discomfort to compromise their missions. Positioning within the log presented another challenge. Snipers needed to orient themselves so they could observe and fire through openings in the rotted wood while maintaining enough comfort to remain motionless for hours. This typically meant lying prone with the rifle pointed down the hollow interior toward a natural opening, or positioning perpendicular to the log's length, with the rifle barrel extending through a gap in the side. Both orientations limited mobility and made rapid adjustment of aim difficult, requiring snipers to select positions where targets would appear within their limited field of fire. The physical ergonomics of hollow log positions required careful consideration. Logs varied enormously in internal dimensions, from barely large enough to accommodate a human body to spaces that could fit multiple people. Smaller logs provided better concealment, but created more severe discomfort during extended occupation. Larger logs offered more room to adjust position subtly, but their size sometimes made them obvious landscape features that drew enemy attention. The ideal log provided just enough interior space for the sniper to position himself comfortably enough to remain motionless for extended periods while maintaining the most natural external appearance possible. Communication represented a particular problem. Snipers normally operated with spotters who observed targets, calculated range and wind, and maintained radio contact with supporting units. Hollow logs typically couldn't accommodate two people, forcing snipers to operate alone or position spotters in separate hides nearby. This separation complicated coordination and left snipers without immediate backup if they were discovered. Solo operation also meant snipers had to perform all observation, calculation, and shooting functions themselves, increasing cognitive load during engagements. The decision to operate without a spotter represented a significant tactical compromise. Two-person sniper teams provided redundancy and distributed cognitive load, allowing one person to focus on observation while the other calculated firing solutions. Spotters could maintain security by monitoring approaches to the sniper's position, providing early warning if enemy forces approached. They maintained radio communications, freeing snipers to concentrate on target engagement. Most critically, spotters could provide covering fire and assist with extraction if positions were compromised. Hollow log concealment forced many snipers to abandon these advantages in exchange for superior concealment. The calculation was stark: better concealment that prevented detection entirely versus maintained capabilities that might prove essential if detected. Snipers who chose hollow logs bet their lives that remaining undetected mattered more than maintaining response capabilities if discovered. This represented a fundamentally different risk assessment than conventional doctrine recommended, prioritizing avoidance over response. Equipment selection for hollow log missions required careful thought. Snipers needed to carry everything they would require for extended periods in confined spaces where resupply was impossible. Water represented the most critical item, as dehydration would compromise both physical capability and mental acuity. However, water's weight limited how much snipers could carry, forcing difficult calculations about mission duration versus load. Most snipers planning multi-day hollow log missions carried absolute minimum water quantities, accepting severe dehydration as inevitable. Food requirements were somewhat more flexible. Humans can function for days without food, though performance gradually degrades. Many snipers on hollow log missions simply didn't eat, carrying only water and ammunition to minimize load. Those who did bring food selected items that required no preparation, produced minimal waste, and wouldn't spoil in tropical heat. Dried fruits, nuts, and compact energy bars became common choices, though even these created waste disposal problems in confined spaces where movement to handle trash could compromise concealment. Ammunition load calculations balanced firepower against weight constraints. Hollow log positions typically involved single engagements or at most a handful of shots before withdrawing, making large ammunition loads unnecessary. However, snipers also recognized that if positions were compromised, they might need to fight their way out or at least provide enough covering fire to facilitate escape. Most settled on carrying enough ammunition for their primary mission, plus a modest reserve for emergencies, typically between 20 and 40 rounds total depending on caliber and individual preference. The true test of any unconventional tactic comes during actual combat employment, and hollow log sniper hides proved their worth repeatedly, despite widespread skepticism. Multiple documented instances from Vietnam demonstrate both the effectiveness and limitations of this concealment method, providing insights into when and how it achieved results. One particularly well-documented case involved a Marine sniper operating near the demilitarized zone in 1967. The sniper, assigned to a reconnaissance team conducting surveillance on a North Vietnamese supply route, established a hide in a large fallen tree approximately 30 meters from a trail that intelligence indicated saw regular enemy traffic. The log measured over a meter in diameter and had fallen years earlier, creating a hollow interior that extended roughly 10 meters before the remaining solid wood blocked further entry. The sniper entered the log during darkness, carrying his rifle, ammunition, water, and minimal rations, sufficient for a 72-hour mission. He positioned himself approximately 4 meters inside the log's entrance, where decay had created a gap in the wood large enough to serve as a firing port, while providing overhead and lateral concealment. His spotter occupied a separate position 20 meters away, concealed in dense undergrowth, where he could observe both the trail and the approaches to the sniper's hide. Over the next 2 days, the sniper observed significant enemy movement along the trail. North Vietnamese soldiers moved in small groups, maintaining tactical spacing and showing awareness that American forces operated in the area. The sniper allowed multiple groups to pass without firing, waiting for high-value targets that justified compromising his position. Military doctrine emphasized that snipers should prioritize enemy leadership, communications personnel, and specialists whose elimination would most disrupt enemy operations. On the mission's second afternoon, a larger group appeared on the trail, including what the spotter identified as probable officers based on their position in the formation and the deference other soldiers showed them. The sniper engaged, firing 3 rounds in rapid succession that killed 2 individuals and wounded a third. The remaining enemy soldiers immediately took cover and returned fire, but their shots went in wrong directions as they couldn't identify where the sniper fire originated. Some fired at the spotter's position, which appeared more obvious than the hollow log hide. North Vietnamese forces searched the area for over an hour, moving cautiously while maintaining defensive positions that limited their exposure. Several soldiers approached within meters of the hollow log, examining the area while the Marine sniper remained motionless inside his hide. The combination of the log's natural appearance and the sniper's absolute stillness prevented detection, despite enemy forces literally standing next to his position. Eventually, the North Vietnamese withdrew, apparently concluding that the sniper had escaped or that they had eliminated the threat through suppressive fire. The Marine remained in position through the night and following day, observing continued enemy activity that indicated the supply route remained operational despite his earlier engagement. When his planned extraction time arrived, he withdrew from the log during darkness and rejoined his team without incident. His after-action report documented the engagement's success and noted that hollow log concealment had allowed him to survive enemy searches that would certainly have discovered conventional hides. When this report reached battalion headquarters, reactions divided sharply. Some officers praised the sniper's initiative and effectiveness, noting that he had achieved the mission objectives while surviving a dangerous situation. Others condemned the tactic as reckless, pointing out that the sniper had placed himself in a position with no escape route and limited ability to defend himself if discovered. The battalion commander ultimately declined to either endorse or prohibit hollow log concealment, leaving the decision to individual sniper teams while directing that any use of the technique should be carefully planned with contingencies for extraction if compromised. This ambiguous official response reflected broader tensions within military organizations between innovation and doctrine. Military effectiveness requires both adherence to proven principles and adaptation to specific circumstances, but determining where to draw the line between acceptable flexibility and dangerous deviation proves consistently difficult. Hollow log hides clearly violated doctrinal principles about maintaining escape routes and tactical mobility, yet they demonstrably achieved results in situations where conventional methods had failed. Additional documented cases from Vietnam support the conclusion that hollow log concealment, despite its risks, provided advantages that other techniques couldn't match. Army snipers operating in the Mekong Delta used hollow logs near waterways to observe Viet Cong movement patterns, achieving intelligence collection that other methods couldn't accomplish. The concealment allowed snipers to remain in position during enemy searches, maintaining observation when conventional hides would have required withdrawal. One Army sniper team operating in the Mekong Delta employed a particularly innovative variation of hollow log concealment. They identified a massive fallen tree, partially submerged in a waterway that enemy forces used for transportation. The log's position near a narrow channel meant that boats had to pass within 50 meters, providing excellent engagement opportunities. However, the location was so obvious that conventional hides would certainly be discovered during enemy security sweeps of the area. The sniper team modified the log by carefully enlarging natural decay cavities to create sufficient interior space while maintaining the external appearance of natural deterioration. They worked at night over several days, removing rotted wood and carrying away debris to prevent evidence of human activity. The result was a hide that could accommodate both sniper and spotter while appearing completely natural from external observation. The team occupied this position during multiple missions spanning several weeks, achieving significant enemy casualties and intelligence collection before eventually relocating when enemy forces began avoiding the area. The psychological dimensions of hollow log concealment deserve examination. Snipers who use this technique reported experiencing intense isolation and sensory deprivation during extended missions. The confined space blocked peripheral vision and limited auditory cues, creating an environment where the sniper's world narrowed to the small area visible through the firing port. This focus enhanced concentration on the target area, but also created psychological stress that some found overwhelming. Time perception altered in strange ways during extended hollow log concealment. Snipers reported that hours seemed to stretch interminably, yet they also experienced periods where time compressed and entire hours passed without clear memory. The monotony of watching an empty trail combined with the need for absolute alertness created cognitive strain that exhausted snipers despite minimal physical activity. Veterans described emerging from hollow log hides mentally drained in ways that conventional positions, which allowed more movement and sensory input, didn't produce. The sensory deprivation effects sometimes produced mild hallucinations or perceptual distortions. Snipers reported seeing movement that wasn't there or hearing sounds that had no source. These phenomena reflected how human brains respond to reduced sensory input by generating phantom stimuli to compensate for the lack of real sensation. Experienced snipers learned to recognize these perceptual artifacts and distinguish them from actual threats, but the process required conscious effort that added to mental fatigue. The physical demands also exceeded what conventional sniper positions required. Remaining motionless in a confined space for days caused muscle cramping, joint stiffness, and circulatory problems. Snipers developed techniques for subtle muscle tensing and relaxation that maintained blood flow without creating visible movement, but these methods only partially addressed the physical toll. Dehydration represented a constant concern, as drinking required movement that might compromise concealment. Many snipers deliberately limited water intake to reduce the need for urination, accepting dehydration as preferable to the impossible logistics of waste management in a hollow log. The waste management problem deserves frank discussion, as it significantly affected hollow log mission planning. Human bodies produce waste that must be eliminated, and doing so in a confined space without creating odor, noise, or movement that could reveal position presented severe challenges. Snipers on missions exceeding 24 hours had to address these biological necessities somehow. Various solutions emerged, all unpleasant and some risky. Some snipers simply held bodily functions for mission duration, accepting the discomfort as necessary. This approach worked for missions lasting up to 2 days, but became increasingly difficult and eventually physically impossible for longer operations. Others used containers to collect waste, then sealed and concealed these containers within the hide until they could be removed during extraction. This method avoided the need to exit the hide, but created odor problems that potentially compromised concealment if enemy forces approached closely. The most extreme approach involved snipers evacuating waste in place within the hide and accepting the profoundly unpleasant conditions this created. Some justified this by noting that the smell of human waste might actually enhance concealment by mimicking the odor of animal droppings found naturally in forest environments. Others simply accepted it as the price of maintaining position when movement for any reason could mean death. The willingness to endure such conditions demonstrated the extraordinary commitment that successful hollow log concealment required. As hollow log concealment gained acceptance within sniper communities, practitioners developed various adaptations and innovations that improved effectiveness while mitigating some inherent disadvantages. These modifications reflected the same innovative spirit that produced the original technique, demonstrating how tactical methods evolve through iterative refinement based on field experience. One important adaptation involved pre-positioning equipment within hollow logs to reduce load during occupation. Snipers who planned to use specific logs for extended periods would cache supplies inside during preliminary reconnaissance missions. Water containers, ammunition, and observation equipment could be hidden within logs days or weeks before actual missions, allowing snipers to enter their hides carrying minimal loads that facilitated stealthy insertion. This approach required confidence that cached supplies wouldn't be discovered or disturbed, but it substantially reduced the physical demands of occupying hollow log positions. The practice of pre-positioning supplies created its own tactical considerations. Cached materials had to be concealed well enough to avoid enemy discovery, yet remain accessible when snipers needed them. Waterproof containers protected supplies from moisture that pervaded rotting logs. Snipers developed marking systems that allowed them to locate cached items in darkness, without creating obvious signs that enemy forces might notice. Some used natural landmarks or memorized distances from specific features. Others employed subtle markings, using materials that appeared natural, but conveyed meaning to those who knew what to look for. Communication improvements partially addressed the isolation problem. Early hollow log users operated in complete radio silence to avoid the noise and electronic signatures that transmissions might create. Later, practitioners developed techniques for maintaining communications while minimizing risks. Throat microphones allowed snipers to transmit sub-vocal messages that produced minimal sound. Receive-only modes let snipers monitor communications without transmitting themselves. Pre-arranged signal schedules allowed spotters to transmit status updates at specified times without requiring responses from snipers unless problems arose. The evolution of communication protocols for hollow log operations reflected broader developments in sniper tactics, emphasizing flexibility and redundancy. Modern military communications recognize that different situations require different approaches, and effective units maintain multiple communication methods rather than relying on single systems. Hollow log snipers contributed to this doctrinal evolution by demonstrating how mission-specific communication plans could maintain essential coordination while accommodating extreme concealment requirements. Optical enhancements improved observation capabilities from the limited fields of view that hollow logs provided. Angled mirrors, borrowed from periscope designs, allowed snipers to observe areas not directly visible through natural firing ports without exposing themselves by moving to different positions. These mirrors had to be positioned carefully to avoid creating telltale reflections that enemy observers might spot, but they substantially increased the observation area that snipers could cover from fixed positions. Fiber optic systems represented more advanced observation improvements. Flexible fiber bundles could be threaded through small gaps in rotting wood, transmitting visual information from locations separated from the main hide. This allowed snipers to establish observation points that enemy searchers wouldn't associate with nearby concealment positions. The technology remained relatively primitive during Vietnam, but showed promise for future applications. Modern variations using miniature cameras and digital displays have realized this potential, though the fundamental concept emerged from Vietnam-era innovations. Climate control modifications addressed the environmental challenges of extended hollow log occupation. Snipers experimented with passive ventilation systems that improved air circulation without creating obvious modifications to log exteriors. Small gaps, strategically positioned, allowed convection to move air through hides, reducing heat buildup and providing fresh oxygen. These modifications had to remain subtle enough to avoid detection while providing meaningful environmental improvement. Success required understanding airflow principles and the ability to visualize how modifications would affect both interior conditions and external appearance. Insulation became another area of innovation. The thermal mass of large logs provided some temperature buffering, but snipers operating in extreme conditions needed additional protection. Some lined sections of hollow logs with natural materials like dried grass or moss that provided insulation while appearing consistent with organic decay processes. Others used synthetic materials hidden beneath natural coverings, creating layered systems that offered superior thermal performance while maintaining authentic external appearance. Structural reinforcement addressed concerns about log collapse. Rotting wood could fail unexpectedly, particularly when weakened by weather or disturbed by nearby impacts. Snipers who planned extended use of specific logs sometimes reinforced internal structures using materials that wouldn't appear suspicious if discovered. Wooden branches positioned as internal bracing could pass as natural collapse debris. Synthetic materials required more careful concealment, but provided superior strength for critical support applications. The innovation in hollow log techniques extended beyond physical modifications to include psychological preparation methods. Snipers recognized that success required mental conditioning as much as physical adaptation. Training programs developed that exposed candidates to progressively longer periods in confined spaces, building tolerance for the claustrophobic conditions and sensory deprivation that actual missions would involve. These exercises identified individuals psychologically suited to hollow log operations, while providing everyone with baseline experience that reduced anxiety during actual deployment. Meditation and mental discipline techniques became part of hollow log training curricula. Snipers learned breathing exercises that promoted calm during extended immobility. Visualization methods helped maintain alertness during periods of inactivity that might otherwise induce sleep or mental drift. Mental rehearsal of engagement sequences prepared snipers to execute complex actions smoothly when opportunities arose after hours of motionless waiting. These psychological tools proved as important as physical skills for successful hollow log operations. The development of mental preparation techniques for hollow log concealment contributed to broader recognition that sniper effectiveness depended on psychological factors as much as physical capabilities. Modern sniper training emphasizes mental conditioning across all aspects of operations, reflecting lessons learned from extreme concealment methods that pushed human psychological limits. The ability to remain calm, focused, and effective during extended periods of uncomfortable isolation in hostile territory represents a skill that distinguishes exceptional snipers from merely competent marksmen. The controversy surrounding hollow log sniper hides reflected deeper questions about how military organizations should balance innovation against established doctrine. Military effectiveness requires both standardization, which ensures predictable performance across units, and adaptation, which allows forces to respond to unexpected circumstances. Determining when unconventional tactics represent valuable innovation versus dangerous deviation from sound principles proves consistently challenging for military leadership. Critics of hollow log concealment raised legitimate concerns about tactical risk. The primary objection centered on the absence of escape routes. Standard sniper doctrine emphasized maintaining the ability to withdraw rapidly if positions became compromised. This principle reflected hard-won lessons from countless engagements where snipers who couldn't escape died or were captured after enemy forces located their positions. Hollow logs offered only one exit, and that exit might be blocked by enemy forces searching the area. A discovered sniper in a hollow log had essentially zero chance of fighting his way out or escaping through maneuver. The confined space also prevented effective self-defense. Snipers normally carried sidearms and sometimes additional weapons for close-range defense if enemies reached their position. Inside a hollow log, these weapons became nearly useless. The sniper couldn't maneuver, couldn't throw grenades effectively, and struggled even to bring his rifle to bear on threats approaching from unexpected directions. If enemy forces discovered the hide, the sniper would be killed or captured before he could mount effective resistance. Communication difficulties compounded these risks. Operating without immediate spotter support meant snipers made tactical decisions alone, without the second opinion that often prevented mistakes. Radio communication from inside hollow logs proved difficult due to signal interference from the surrounding wood and earth, potentially leaving snipers unable to call for support if situations deteriorated. This isolation contradicted principles emphasizing that no soldier should operate without communication links to supporting forces. Medical considerations added another layer of concern. If snipers were wounded while in hollow log hides, extraction would prove extraordinarily difficult. The confined space prevented self-treatment of many injuries and made evacuation by other personnel nearly impossible without exposing both the wounded sniper and rescuers to continued enemy fire. Conventional positions allowed wounded snipers to receive immediate aid from spotters and facilitated medical evacuation using established procedures. Hollow logs turned medical emergencies into likely fatalities. Environmental hazards presented additional dangers that critics emphasized. Rotting logs housed various wildlife, including venomous snakes and insects whose bites could incapacitate snipers. Fungal spores from decaying wood caused respiratory problems. The damp, enclosed environment promoted hypothermia during cool weather and heat exhaustion during hot periods. These hazards existed in other concealment locations, but intensified in confined spaces where snipers couldn't move to address problems or adjust to changing conditions. The risk of structural collapse represented another concern that conventional positions didn't share. Rotting wood could fail under stress, potentially trapping snipers beneath collapsed material or compromising concealment by creating obvious disturbances. Logs weakened by decay might collapse if struck by shrapnel or subjected to concussion from nearby explosions. Unlike deliberately constructed hides where snipers could assess structural integrity, hollow logs presented unknown structural risks that could materialize without warning. Advocates for hollow log concealment countered these objections with arguments based on operational effectiveness and tactical necessity. They pointed out that conventional sniper positions in dense jungle often proved equally dangerous when enemy forces controlled terrain and could search thoroughly. Traditional hides required construction or modification of natural features that created disturbances enemy observers might detect. Hollow logs needed no preparation and appeared completely natural, eliminating the risk that enemy forces would notice signs of human activity. The concealment that hollow logs provided proved superior to alternatives in specific circumstances. During enemy searches, snipers in conventional hides often had to withdraw to avoid detection, abandoning their positions and losing the opportunity to observe or engage enemy forces. Hollow log concealment allowed snipers to remain in position during searches, maintaining observation and preserving the option to engage high-value targets that conventional hides couldn't achieve. This persistence created operational value that offset tactical risks. Proponents also argued that risk assessment should consider the entire tactical context rather than isolated position characteristics. While hollow logs offered no escape route if directly discovered, their superior concealment made discovery far less likely than in conventional positions. A 95% chance of remaining undetected in an inescapable position might prove safer than a 50% detection probability in a position with escape routes, since escaping under enemy fire carried its own lethal risks. The relevant question wasn't whether hollow logs posed risks, but whether those risks exceeded alternatives in specific situations. The mathematical argument about relative risk probabilities deserves detailed examination. Military operations always involve risk, and effective commanders must compare risks across alternatives rather than seeking impossible zero-risk options. Consider a hypothetical scenario where a sniper must observe a specific trail for 72 hours. A conventional hide offers escape routes, but has a 60% probability of detection during enemy searches. A hollow log position has a 10% detection probability, but zero escape chance if discovered. In the conventional hide scenario, the 60% detection probability means the sniper likely gets discovered. With escape routes available, assume he has a 30% chance of successfully withdrawing under fire. This yields an overall survival probability of 40% chance of not being detected, plus 18% chance of being detected but escaping, totaling 58% survival. The hollow log scenario provides a 90% chance of not being detected, yielding 90% survival probability. Even accounting for uncertainty in these estimates, the superior concealment substantially outweighs the escape route disadvantage. This analytical framework explains why experienced snipers sometimes chose hollow logs despite doctrinal prohibitions. They intuitively understood that total risk depends on both consequences and probabilities. An outcome that would be catastrophic if it occurred might still represent the lower risk choice if its probability is sufficiently small. Conversely, maintaining capabilities to respond to adverse events provides little value if those capabilities can't prevent the adverse outcomes that inferior concealment makes likely. The debate ultimately revealed how tactical effectiveness depends on matching methods to circumstances rather than applying universal rules. Hollow log concealment worked best in specific situations: dense jungle or forest terrain with abundant fallen trees, enemy forces that moved predictably along defined routes, missions emphasizing observation or single engagements rather than sustained combat, and snipers with psychological temperament suited to confined spaces and extended isolation. In these circumstances, hollow logs offered advantages that justified their risks. In different environments or mission profiles, the same technique would prove inappropriately dangerous. This situational nature of tactical effectiveness challenges military organizations that prefer standardized procedures applicable across varied circumstances. Doctrine provides predictability, and reduces the cognitive load on leaders who must make rapid decisions under stress. Techniques that work only in specific situations complicate training, create opportunities for misapplication, and resist incorporation into standardized procedures. Military bureaucracies naturally resist tactical innovations that don't fit neatly into existing frameworks, even when those innovations demonstrably work in particular contexts. The institutional resistance to situational tactics reflects deeper organizational dynamics. Military hierarchies depend on subordinates following standard procedures that superiors can predict and coordinate. Allowing excessive deviation from standards complicates command and control by making unit behaviors less predictable. Commanders planning operations need confidence that subordinate units will perform as doctrine specifies, not make independent decisions to employ unconventional methods that might conflict with larger plans. However, excessive standardization creates brittleness by preventing adaptation to circumstances that doctrine didn't anticipate. Enemy forces innovate continuously, developing tactics that exploit weaknesses in standard procedures. Terrain and weather vary enormously across operational theaters, making techniques optimized for one environment potentially ineffective in others. Rigid adherence to doctrine in faces of changed circumstances yields predictable failure against adaptive adversaries operating in varied conditions. Effective military organizations resolve this tension by distinguishing between core principles that apply universally and specific applications that adapt to circumstances. The principle that snipers need concealment applies universally. The specific technique for achieving concealment varies with environment, enemy capabilities, and mission requirements. Doctrine should specify principles while preserving flexibility in application, allowing subordinates to exercise judgment within defined bounds, while maintaining enough standardization for coordinated operations. The resolution of the hollow log controversy reflected this institutional ambivalence. Rather than officially endorsing or prohibiting the technique, most units left decisions to individual snipers and their immediate commanders. This approach acknowledged both the technique's demonstrated effectiveness and its incompatibility with doctrinal orthodoxy. Snipers who understood the risks and believed hollow log concealment suited their mission could employ the technique, while those who preferred conventional methods weren't compelled to adopt practices they found unsafe or unsuitable. This decentralized approach to tactical decisions empowered small unit leaders and individual specialists to apply their expertise and judgment to specific situations. It recognized that people closest to problems often understand those problems better than distant commanders, even when distant commanders possess greater experience and broader perspective. However, decentralization also created risks that individuals would make poor decisions that endangered themselves or compromised larger missions. Finding the right balance between centralized control and distributed decision-making remains an enduring challenge for military organizations operating across varied environments against adaptive adversaries. The eventual vindication of hollow log concealment tactics came gradually, as accumulating evidence demonstrated their effectiveness across multiple operational environments. While the technique never became officially endorsed doctrine, it earned quiet acceptance within sniper communities and influenced broader thinking about unconventional tactics and individual initiative. By the later years of the Vietnam War, hollow log concealment had become a recognized option in the informal body of knowledge that experienced snipers passed to new personnel. Training didn't formally include hollow log techniques, but veteran snipers shared their experiences during informal conversations, describing what worked and what didn't, based on actual employment. This oral tradition preserved tactical innovations that formal doctrine overlooked, creating a parallel curriculum that prepared snipers for realities they would face in combat. After-action reviews and operational assessments gradually acknowledged hollow log concealment's role in successful missions. Officers who had initially condemned the technique as suicidal revised their opinions when confronted with evidence that snipers using hollow logs survived missions where those using conventional hides were killed or forced to withdraw. Several documented cases showed hollow log positions surviving enemy searches that discovered and eliminated nearby conventional hides, providing concrete evidence that superior concealment could offset tactical inflexibility. One particularly influential assessment came from a Marine colonel who conducted comprehensive review of sniper operations in his regiment's area of responsibility. The analysis compared mission success rates, sniper casualties, and enemy losses across different concealment methods and terrain types. The data showed that hollow log concealment, while used relatively infrequently, achieved notably higher success rates in dense jungle terrain than alternatives. Snipers using hollow logs completed missions more often, suffered lower casualty rates, and achieved higher enemy casualty counts than those using conventional positions in comparable situations. This quantitative evidence proved more persuasive than individual anecdotes because it demonstrated patterns across multiple engagements rather than isolated successes that might reflect luck rather than tactical soundness. The assessment concluded that while hollow log concealment shouldn't become standard procedure, it represented a legitimate tactical option that commanders should allow experienced snipers to employ when circumstances warranted. This official recognition, though carefully qualified, marked a significant shift from earlier outright condemnation. The broader impact of hollow log tactics extended beyond sniper operations to influence thinking about tactical innovation generally. The controversy highlighted how combat effectiveness sometimes requires methods that violate established principles, forcing military organizations to reconsider how they evaluate and incorporate unconventional approaches. Several lessons emerged that shaped subsequent military culture around innovation and adaptation. First, the experience reinforced that tactical doctrine provides guidelines rather than absolute rules. Principles like maintaining escape routes and tactical mobility generally enhance survival and effectiveness, but specific circumstances sometimes justify accepting risks that doctrine normally prohibits. Effective military organizations need mechanisms for allowing calculated deviations from doctrine when situational factors make unconventional approaches more appropriate than standard procedures. Second, hollow log tactics demonstrated the importance of preserving space for individual initiative, even within hierarchical military structures. The technique emerged from individual soldiers adapting to specific challenges they faced, not from centralized planning or systematic analysis. Military effectiveness depends on empowering individuals to innovate within their scope of responsibility, while maintaining sufficient discipline to ensure coordinated action at larger scales. Finding this balance proves consistently difficult but remains essential to combat effectiveness. Third, the eventual acceptance of hollow log concealment showed how military organizations can learn from bottom-up innovation when institutional mechanisms capture and evaluate field experience. The informal sharing of techniques among snipers preserved knowledge that formal channels initially rejected, creating a reservoir of practical wisdom that eventually influenced official thinking. Organizations that facilitate this kind of knowledge sharing, rather than demanding strict adherence to centralized doctrine, gain adaptability that enhances effectiveness across varied circumstances. Modern sniper training acknowledges hollow log concealment as part of the historical evolution of sniper tactics, without necessarily teaching it as a standard technique. Instructors describe the technique's development, explain the tactical reasoning behind its use, and discuss both advantages and dangers. This approach exposes trainees to unconventional thinking, while emphasizing that effectiveness requires matching methods to circumstances rather than applying cookbook solutions to varied problems. Special operations forces, which emphasize individual initiative and adaptation to unique circumstances, have incorporated hollow log principles into broader concealment training. Rather than teaching hollow log specifically, instructors emphasize the underlying principles, achieving superior concealment through absolute stillness and natural camouflage, accepting tactical constraints in exchange for specific advantages, and making calculated risk assessments based on mission requirements rather than generic safety principles. These principles apply across varied environments and situations, making them more valuable than teaching specific techniques that work only in particular circumstances. The psychological aspects of hollow log concealment also influenced modern training in stress management and sensory deprivation. Trainers recognize that snipers need mental preparation for extended isolation in confined spaces, leading to exercises that deliberately create similar conditions in training environments. Modern sniper courses include extended observation exercises where students must remain motionless in uncomfortable positions for hours building both physical endurance and psychological resilience that missions might require. The statement that officers later admitted hollow log concealment saved the unit carries profound significance. Military leadership rarely acknowledges that unconventional methods violated doctrine proved superior to officially sanctioned approaches. Such admissions challenge institutional authority and suggest that established procedures might not represent optimal solutions. When officers do make these acknowledgements, it reflects recognition that combat effectiveness matters more than preserving doctrinal orthodoxy or institutional pride. The admission also validated the judgment of individual snipers who chose to employ hollow log concealment despite official disapproval and personal risk. These soldiers bet their lives that their tactical assessment was superior to doctrinal wisdom, accepting both physical danger and potential professional consequences if their gamble failed. The eventual recognition that they were correct vindicated not just their specific tactical choice, but their broader assertion of individual judgment against institutional consensus. This vindication matters because military organizations depend on both obedience and initiative, creating inherent tension between following orders and exercising independent judgment. Soldiers must generally follow established procedures to ensure coordinated operations and maintain discipline, but they must also recognize when circumstances require deviation from standard practices and possess courage to act on that recognition, despite potential consequences. The hollow log story demonstrates that military effectiveness sometimes requires individuals to trust their judgment, even when formal authority disagrees. Placing hollow log sniper concealment in broader historical context reveals patterns in how unconventional tactics emerge, face resistance, and sometimes gain acceptance. Military history contains numerous examples of techniques that initially appeared suicidal or foolish, but proved effective in specific circumstances, eventually influencing doctrine despite violating established principles. Trench raiding in World War I provides a useful comparison. Early in that war, military doctrine emphasized holding defensive positions and avoiding unnecessary exposure to enemy fire. The concept of deliberately crossing no man's land to attack enemy trenches seemed suicidal given machine gun and artillery coverage. Yet soldiers developed raiding techniques that achieved objectives conventional attacks couldn't accomplish, gathering intelligence, capturing prisoners, destroying specific facilities, and maintaining offensive spirit during periods of strategic stalemate. Successful raiders used darkness, surprise, and intimate knowledge of enemy positions to enter trenches, accomplish specific objectives, and withdraw before defenders could organize effective response. The techniques violated doctrinal principles about maintaining formation and sustaining attacks until objectives were secured, instead emphasizing speed, stealth, and tactical flexibility. Initial military leadership condemned raiding as waste of lives that accomplished little, but accumulating evidence of effectiveness eventually led to formal incorporation into doctrine and dedicated training for specialized raiding units. The parallels to hollow log concealment are striking. Both techniques emerged from soldiers adapting to specific tactical problems that conventional methods couldn't solve. Both violated established doctrinal principles about acceptable risk and proper tactics. Both faced institutional resistance from leadership committed to orthodox approaches. Yet both proved effective in circumstances that matched their strengths, eventually gaining recognition despite never becoming universal practices. The development of hugging tactics against superior firepower offers another parallel. When facing enemies with overwhelming artillery or air support, various forces discovered that closing to extremely close range neutralized these advantages by making fire support too dangerous to friendly forces. This technique appeared suicidal because it meant advancing directly toward enemy positions under fire, yet it sometimes proved safer than remaining at distances where enemies could employ their firepower advantages without endangering themselves. Soviet forces used hugging tactics extensively against German forces during World War II, recognizing that German advantages in artillery and air support became liabilities at close quarters, where employment risked friendly fire casualties. Chinese forces employed similar approaches against American forces in Korea, accepting casualties during approach marches to reach ranges where American firepower advantages diminished. In both cases, accepting risks that conventional doctrine condemned proved tactically sound when alternatives faced even greater dangers. Tunnel warfare provides another historical parallel. During sieges throughout history, forces dug tunnels under enemy fortifications to plant explosives or provide infiltration routes. The practice reached sophisticated heights during World War I, when opposing forces dug elaborate tunnel systems beneath no man's land, sometimes intersecting with enemy tunnels and fighting underground battles. The confined spaces, constant danger of collapse and vulnerability to enemy countermining made tunnel warfare extraordinarily dangerous, yet it proved essential for breaking particularly strong defensive positions. Military leadership initially resisted dedicating resources to tunnel warfare, viewing it as specialized activity with limited applicability. However, the impossibility of breaking certain fortified positions through conventional assault eventually forced acceptance that specialized techniques, despite their dangers and limited scope, served necessary functions. Modern military forces retain specialist engineers trained in underground operations, acknowledging that some tactical problems require methods that would be inappropriate as general practice. The development of scout sniper tactics in the Pacific Theater offers particularly relevant comparisons. Marine snipers operating against Japanese defenders faced enemies who used terrain with masterful effectiveness, concealing themselves in positions Americans initially couldn't detect. Japanese soldiers would remain motionless in spider holes or elevated positions for days, engaging American troops at close range with devastating surprise. American snipers had to develop comparable patience and concealment discipline to counter these tactics. This required adopting methods that conventional training hadn't covered, remaining motionless for extended periods despite discomfort, accepting close proximity to enemy forces, and prioritizing concealment over mobility. Many of the techniques that proved effective, including extended stays in confined natural features, closely paralleled the hollow log method that would later emerge in Vietnam. More recently, urban sniper operations in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan have required adaptations that violate conventional doctrine about position selection and tactical mobility. Snipers operating in dense urban terrain sometimes establish positions in locations with limited escape routes, because those locations provide essential observation or fields of fire that alternatives can't match. The tactical calculus accepts risks that doctrine normally prohibits when mission requirements make those risks necessary. These historical parallels suggest general principles about tactical innovation in military organizations. Unconventional techniques emerge when conventional methods prove inadequate for specific challenges that soldiers face. Initial resistance from institutional leadership reflects legitimate concerns about risk and the difficulties of incorporating situational tactics into standardized doctrine. Eventual acceptance depends on accumulating evidence that techniques achieve results that justify their costs, combined with institutional mechanisms that allow bottom-up innovation to influence top-down doctrine. The pattern also reveals tensions inherent in military organizations between standardization and adaptation. Militaries require standardization to ensure units can operate together predictably and that training produces consistent capabilities across personnel. Yet combat environments vary enormously, and techniques effective in one situation may prove useless or counterproductive in another. Successful military organizations find ways to maintain core standardization while preserving flexibility for adaptation to specific circumstances. The comparison across these examples reveals that military effectiveness requires both discipline and flexibility, both adherence to proven principles and willingness to adapt when circumstances demand different approaches. Organizations that achieve this balance, maintaining doctrinal foundations while preserving space for innovation, consistently outperform those that lean too far toward either rigid orthodoxy or chaotic improvisation. The challenge lies in creating institutional cultures and command structures that encourage appropriate innovation while preventing dangerous deviation from sound principles. The story of hollow log sniper concealment offers insights that extend beyond the specific tactic to broader questions about military effectiveness, innovation, and the relationship between doctrine and practical adaptation. Understanding why this unconventional method initially faced condemnation but eventually earned grudging respect reveals important truths about how military organizations can balance competing demands for standardization and flexibility. The individuals who pioneered hollow log concealment operated at the sharp edge where military doctrine meets combat reality. They recognized that survival and mission success sometimes required violating principles that made sense in general, but didn't fit specific situations. Their willingness to accept risks that formal doctrine prohibited reflected both professional judgment and the immediate pressure of enemy contact that made conventional approaches inadequate. These soldiers demonstrated the kind of initiative that military organizations claim to value, but often resist when it produces methods that don't fit established frameworks. The officers who initially condemned hollow log concealment as suicidal weren't wrong to worry about the technique's inherent dangers. Their concerns reflected legitimate understanding of tactical principles developed through extensive combat experience. The absence of escape routes really did create potentially lethal situations if snipers were discovered. The confined spaces really did limit defensive options and complicate extraction if personnel were wounded. These objections identified real problems rather than simply reflecting bureaucratic inflexibility. What changed wasn't the validity of these concerns, but the recognition that different tactical situations require different risk calculations. In dense jungle against enemy forces that knew terrain intimately and searched thoroughly, conventional sniper positions often proved equally dangerous while providing inferior concealment. The relevant question wasn't whether hollow logs posed risks, but whether those risks exceeded alternatives in specific circumstances. Officers who eventually acknowledged the technique's value made more sophisticated risk assessments that considered entire tactical contexts rather than isolated position characteristics. This evolution in thinking reflects institutional learning that military organizations must cultivate to remain effective. Combat environments change, enemy forces adapt, and techniques that worked previously may prove inadequate against new challenges. Organizations that insist on rigid adherence to established doctrine, regardless of circumstances, lose effectiveness as doctrine becomes increasingly mismatched to reality. Successful military forces develop mechanisms for incorporating lessons from field experience into evolving doctrine that maintains core principles while adapting specific applications to changing conditions. The statement that officers later admitted hollow log concealment saved the unit carries significant meaning. Military leadership rarely admits mistakes or acknowledges that unconventional methods prove superior to official doctrine. When officers do make such admissions, it reflects recognition that combat effectiveness matters more than institutional pride. The willingness to acknowledge that soldiers who violated doctrine actually achieved better results than those who followed it demonstrates the kind of intellectual honesty that distinguishes effective military organizations from brittle bureaucracies. Modern military forces face similar tensions around innovation and doctrine across numerous domains. Cyber warfare, drone operations, and information campaigns all present tactical challenges where conventional approaches prove inadequate and unconventional methods may offer advantages despite violating established principles. How military organizations respond to these challenges will determine effectiveness in future conflicts that may look very different from past wars that shaped existing doctrine. The hollow log example suggests that effective response requires preserving space for experimentation and innovation while maintaining sufficient structure to ensure coordinated action and institutional learning. This balance proves difficult to achieve in practice, as organizations naturally tend toward either excessive rigidity that stifles innovation or excessive flexibility that prevents accumulation of systematic knowledge. Finding the right balance requires conscious effort to create institutional mechanisms that capture field experience, evaluate innovations fairly, and update doctrine when evidence supports change. The soldiers who crawled into hollow logs to engage enemy forces demonstrated courage that transcended physical bravery. They showed willingness to trust their judgment against institutional consensus, accepting both tactical risks and professional consequences if their unconventional methods failed. This kind of moral courage, the willingness to do what seems right despite formal prohibition, represents an essential quality that military organizations need, but struggle to preserve within hierarchical structures that emphasize obedience and standardization. The world called hollow log concealment a death trap because it violated every conventional wisdom about maintaining tactical mobility and escape routes. Officers condemned it as suicidal foolishness, that would get soldiers killed without achieving meaningful results. Yet in the crucible of combat, this unconventional approach achieved effectiveness that traditional methods couldn't match. The eventual acknowledgement that it saved lives and accomplished missions demonstrates how battlefield results ultimately matter more than theoretical objections, regardless of how well-founded those objections might be. This story reminds us that military effectiveness emerges from combining disciplined adherence to proven principles with flexibility to adapt when circumstances demand unconventional approaches. The challenge facing military organizations is preserving both discipline and flexibility simultaneously, maintaining enough standardization to ensure predictable performance while allowing enough adaptation to address situations that doctrine didn't anticipate. Success requires leadership that distinguishes between soldiers who violate doctrine recklessly versus those who make calculated decisions that circumstances justify, even when those decisions produce short-term discomfort for institutional hierarchies. The legacy of hollow log sniper concealment extends beyond its tactical utility to influence how military forces think about innovation, risk, and the relationship between individual initiative and institutional authority. The technique itself may have limited applicability in modern warfare, but the principles it exemplifies remain permanently relevant. Combat effectiveness requires matching methods to circumstances, accepting risks when potential benefits justify them, and maintaining intellectual humility about whether current doctrine truly represents optimal approaches or simply reflects historical inertia. They called it a death trap, and perhaps they were right. But they also later admitted it saved the unit, and that admission matters more than any initial condemnation. The willingness to acknowledge when unconventional methods work better than orthodox doctrine demonstrates the kind of organizational learning that separates effective military forces from those that repeatedly fight the last war with outdated methods. The hollow log sniper hide stands as testament to the power of individual innovation and the importance of institutional flexibility in the most serious human endeavor, warfare where lives and national survival hang in the balance.